how would you go about verifying news sources?
So this is a question that I get challenged with a lot because you're arguing with somebody on social media, and they ask you to verify your sources, and a lot of what I use Snopes. I use Snopes a lot. I've done a decent amount of research on them. I know that they're slightly left leaning, but I have found a lot on their site about like Hillary, even Barack Obama. That's not 100% leftist, and so to me that tells me that they're a pretty good they're a pretty good news source. They also, I remember I was looking up these billboards, which were, I guess they were pro life related, and they got it down to the point where they had a phone number for the company that sold that billboard, so that they basically called it and asked them who had, like, put up money to build it, and sure enough, it was a religious and conservative related group that was like lobbying for these billboards to be put up. But I feel like that kind of detail, and just them going into that in their claim to truth, it meant a lot to me, truth wise. But really, that's not the only source that I use. I really enjoy personal blogs and podcasts. I find a lot of different podcasts, even ones that aren't politically charged, to be very useful ways to get that kind of information. Like true crime podcasts like Sword and Scale, ones that use like real audio or real reports, are very good. Rewire Radio is great for women's rights, reproductive rights, state laws, that type of thing. Uh, and personal blogs of people just telling stories about the issues that they're having with the government in their state. You can't really argue with those kind of statements, because these people have nothing to gain by lying about it. They're not being paid to do this. They're offering their opinion about something that happened to them that they didn't appreciate, that had to do with like our local government. And a lot of those types of things can actually be found on Reddit. A lot of times, if you delve really far deep into Reddit, sometimes I even go onto the conservative side of Facebook and the conservative side of Reddit to kind of like cross reference things. And I find that even if something is posted kind of as fake news, it almost solidifies my claims to see it from that other side and do that extra bit of research. um, what was recently in the news? Right, it was around Easter. And Obama made a tweet about how all these Easter celebrators. I hope that they're safe because there was a terrorist attack. I think it was either in India, Beirut, or Saudi Arabia. It was in the Middle East. And this conservative group that I follow on Facebook framed it as though Obama was hating on Christians by describing them as Easter worshippers. So I delved into this. Like, I did a little bit of research, and I found out that the reason why he used Easter worshippers and not specifically Christians is that in that specific country, I do believe it's India, people who practice the Buddhist faith also celebrate Easter. So he was being, politically correct by referring to everyone as a worshiper and not a Christian. But you can see in situations like that, it's good to see the other side, because you're like, oh, I get why this fake news was produced. I get why it's believable, because they're not taking that extra effort to look into why something might be worded that way. It tends to be like a split second decision where, I mean, obviously that probably sold the article to some people. I mean, nobody's gonna make a big deal about Obama, telling people that they need to be safe and that, he hopes that they're not hurt. It's gonna make more sense for them to produce an article that's like, oh, Obama hates Christians. He didn't mention them in this tweet. He hates them. And so that's why I find that having so many different avenues to see these articles and view the news is very useful for me finding the truth of the matter. Um, there's also like specific ones like the Guardian and the Washington Post are good, like they're good flip sides because they're a really popular website to get news from. So, if you're looking for something that's sort of mainstream or something that's trending to kind of look into, they're good websites for that. Um, the Guardian, I think more so, is a little bit more ethical, and I find articles on there to be slightly more impartial. Uh, but yeah, that's kind of how I verify my news.
Awesome. How do I validate my news sources? Well, the first thing I always do is assume that whatever news I'm looking at is fake, for lack of a better word. I then look to see if anyone else is reporting, additionally, what the original source is. I will then comb through the article and look for what sources they themselves list. The goal here is that I'm trying to find the original source, whether that's, if it's a quote, the original person saying it. If it's an event, then I'm looking for a recording or otherwise verified sources, people that were actually there talking about it. Or if it's a quote on a statistic, I look to see where that statistic came from. And based off of the website, I look to see who paid to collect those resources or those statistics. Generally, if I look at something like, say, a climate change paper, and it's paid for by a bunch of oil companies that directly benefit from people doubting climate change, I'm very likely to not believe those statistics or to otherwise assume that they are biased in some way as to spin a story in the benefactor's favor. All right, so just a quick recap. Assume everything's fake news. Get multiple sources. Find the original source from those sources, and then find out who's paying for all of this. Typically, if a source tends to quote the original sources frequently, or if they post a story and then an original source validates that story, I'm more inclined to follow that source more often. As an example, back when New York Times released an article saying, Donald Trump Jr. had been sitting in on a meeting with a Russian agent, specifically looking for information about the 2016 election, I was very doubtful until that evening when Donald Trump Jr. himself released a bunch of documents stating that he had been at that meeting and showing everything that he had said, basically validating the story that he had gone there looking for dirt on the 2016 election, which was illegal. If an news organization consistently tells the truth that is validated, I'm more likely to believe them. How would you go about verifying news sources?
That would depend on basically what was being reported, but generally speaking, the words that I want to get out there are cross-reference. To me, that is the best way to understand what is probably true, and that's not even like that's true. This is just like an approximation. Would be to cross-reference various news sources, and that's only one part of it. Another thing would be to what I do a lot, like if there's a news story about a bill or something to that effect, and I'm like, everyone's talking about what's in it. I just, if I care, I'll read it. If I don't, I won't listen to stories about it. And generally speaking, if you read it, you will find that it's not what they said, whatever, in the media, and it's not like they lied about it. They focused on a part of it that was particularly advantageous to their perspective. Fox News basically exists to prop up the Republican Party. Every other news source basically exists to prop up the social order plus the Democratic Party. That's just how I see it. I think a lot of people on the far left and on the right see it that way. But a lot of people on the normal left or like the center left probably don't see it that way. Like when I watch CNN, I'm like, this is bullshit. This is clearly bullshit, and they're clearly supportive of the Democratic Party, which is really weird. So my thing is, like, when I watch a news source, it's like, okay, so you said that. Who else said that? Who else said this? And then try to find an actual source of the information to begin with. If somebody says, an anonymous sources say this, well, how the fuck are you going to check that out? There's no way to check that out. And in that case, I think what you really need to, if you're trying to be specific, what you need to do is look into the writer, look into the author, and look into the paper. And so then we get into like the more, what I would say is more left-wing, my more left-wing view on this, which is like, if you look at the work of Chomsky, he talks about in Manufacturing Consent and other works, how there are filters for the media. Would be things like sponsorship, obviously what the sponsor wants. It used to be anti-communism, but I think now it would probably just be anti-terrorism or something like that. And everything goes through these kind of filters to get to you, and the idea would be to look up Manufacturing Consent if you want all the filters. And the idea would be to just remove them. I think ideological too is one of the filters, and I don't think he ever mentioned that, which I think is kind of funny, but because he definitely has an ideological filter. Noam Chomsky's an absolute genius, but he ignores things that very clearly would point him in other directions. But that's just my opinion. But so if you're cross-referencing and if you're removing what you assume are filters, I mean, you like when I watch the news, I read between the lines, or I think I am anyway. I mean, when someone says something, it's not so much about. I do not watch the news for information as much as I do for what I think they want me to think. I go, what is it that today is the message that they want me to believe? And that's why I turn on the news, because I want to know that. And it probably sounds stupid. I don't care, but that's how I look at it, because I've never seen it as straightforward. It's never to me come off as straightforward. And I mean, like if you read articles, you can feel from a lot of people just they're dripping with opinion and with they're just possessed by ideas, and and that's not how journalism's supposed to fucking be, obviously. So if somebody sounds like they're ideologically biased, you should obviously, that's a filter you should immediately think of as coloring what they're saying. So if I was in charge, this is never gonna fucking happen. If I was in charge of like one of these news companies, I would make it a rule that you had to actually leave references and footnotes for everything, unless it was an anonymous source. And that would be the best way to do it. When you read a book, you can check footnotes.